Welcome to A Moment of Bach, where we take our favorite moments from the composer's vast musical output, just a minute's worth, or even a few seconds, and show you why we think they are remarkable. We are your hosts, Alex and Christian Giebert, and today's moment comes from a bass aria near the end of the beloved Cantata number 147, Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben. Listener Riley writes, "My latest moment of Bach comes from this cantata. The moment is the second last movement before the famous Jesus bleibet meine Freude. My favorite moment from this cantata is the opening to Ich will von Jesu Wundern singen. Where do I even start? The magnificent embellishment and full technical display of the Baroque trumpet sets the mood for the movement." Translated to English, the opening lyrics are, "I shall sing of the wonders of Jesus," and the trumpet certainly achieves this feeling to the highest degree of joy. The way in which Bach composed this movement, it feels like it has a bouncy quality to it. The way in which instruments play off each other, finishing one another's melodic lines. It presents a feeling to the listener that the instruments are talking to each other, supporting each other. This is a pure reflection of Jesus in Bach's text setting, who I believe is represented by the trumpet. Riley's point about the instruments playing off each other, finishing one another's melodic lines. There is something fascinating going on here with the orchestration. We'll talk about that after we introduce or even remind our listeners of the context of the cantata that we're listening to. It is the cantata that contains the most famous part of a cantata. It is the first time we've looked at this cantata Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben outside of bonus content or guest interview, but it is the cantata that contains two instances, two verses of what we would now call Jesu joy of man's desiring. But the lesser-known parts of the cantata are brilliant as well, and one thing that you would not notice unless you experienced an entire performance is the full scope of the instruments used. The use of a single trumpet suggests a joyous fanfare quality. Then you have two oboes, and the oboe and the trumpet share some sort of sound color union that kind of crosses between them. There's a written out bassoon part, which is a little unusual. What's more common is that there's three string parts, violin 1, violin 2, and viola, and then a choir, and then a bass continuo part written out. That is the instrumentation we see in the glorious opening of this cantata. Immediately we hear a bright C major trumpet playing here in a fanfare arrangement of notes. That'll come back up in our moment for today. A sort of secondary theme in the vocal parts has the jumpy sort of Herz und Mund und Tat und, and then those are a lot of times just laying out an arpeggio of a triad. So the theme, cool. There's a motive of the arpeggiated triad that is the broken chord. Right. And that has to do with sort of the physics of the trumpet, but also the way it carries over into the voice parts too. But what's cool is that the trumpet line at the very beginning, the first measure, lays out everything rhythmically that's going to happen in the very first measure. The trumpet has bum 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 bum, the arpeggio of the triad, and then immediately, and then da 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 thing is the first choral theme. It's it's slowed down to half speed in the choral part. It is that. It's just half speed, as what the trumpet did in the first measure. So the trumpet gives us both the secondary and the primary themes immediately in the first measure. And this is so Bach, to condense everything into a little subject. Obviously, that's one reason why he was so good at fugue. But here he does it, he just gives us a little foretaste, like a little mini 2-second long overture that's going to explain the rest of this movement. And really, if you look at the orchestration in this movement, he's either doing these long stepwise running sort of noodly lines that are all steps, or he's doing arpeggios of triads, and he's usually making a distinction between the two. And also you mentioned the written out bassoon part, which is a little unusual, and it kind of only matters in like 4 measures of this. It's not like the bassoon has a big feature, but it is true that in the recap section after a middle choral section of this, when it goes back to the main theme, and here it's doing the main theme in F major, so we haven't really got back to the C major tonality yet, but here, and this is measure 43, the bassoon gets that bum 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 bum. It's doing that while the continuo doesn't quite have that exact part. Then the bassoon is thereafter sort of almost doubling the bass voice. So he's got a couple of different things going on that he wants the bassoon to be slightly distinct, but you can perform this without a bassoon and you won't miss too much. Besides missing that tone color, you won't actually miss much of what Bach has written there, and there are kind of ways around that. It's a long cantata, and closer to the end, in the second half of the cantata, there's some storytelling by a alto recitative, sung here by countertenor Alex Potter. It's the story of Mary visiting Elizabeth. Elizabeth is pregnant with John, who would become John the Baptist. When she comes to visit, John stirs and moves in the womb as Mary mentions Jesus. This wraps up with a gorgeous imitative duet for the oboes, the tenor oboes, oboes da caccia. Then it's on to something completely different with our moment today, a bass aria, which reminds us of the opening with a trumpet fanfare. It is actually the inverted version of that fanfare, sort of, right, Christian? Yeah. Bum 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 da, 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 da. And this one, dun 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 dun. You could put them together and it would totally work. It would absolutely work, if they were smashed together. What's a little subtle, and you can tell only really by looking at the musical score, or if you have a really good ear for orchestration and instrument blending, is that the first few notes of the trumpet are alone, completely just the trumpet, and then when the orchestra re-enters, the first oboe and the first violin are in unison with the trumpet until the end of the first phrase. And then on that second phrase, bum ba da 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 da, 2 notes are in unison, the first 2, but then the little shape bum, there at the end, da 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 da, is not. That's just trumpet. And then it's answered by the strings, and then it's answered again by the trumpet and oboe 1 in unison. And at that point, the violin 1, oboe 1, and trumpet 1 are in unison again, until the trumpet holds a high note. The high G, and then the oboes and violins descend. because the trumpet can't play that. So this gets a little bit into the acoustic physics of the trumpet. The Baroque trumpet cannot play the notes in the gaps in the lower range, so they can play those broken chords down there, but they cannot play the notes in between because valves had not been invented yet. So Bach took this limitation and turned it into a challenge and an advantage for himself, and only wrote stepwise notes, fast 16th notes as well, up in the higher register. And when an instrumental part moves down, it's taken over by oboes and violins who can play all of the notes. But the effect of all of this practical writing is that there is a very loose musical texture, which is not always a thing that happens in Baroque music. In Baroque music, we expect a consistency in the number of parts that we hear. In choir, we hear 4 parts SATB. In the orchestra, we often hear 4 parts, violin 1, violin 2, viola, and the bass line, which is usually cello plus others. You can assign other instruments in the orchestra to those 4 parts. Sometimes there's 5, maybe even 6, but usually it's 4. But this musical texture is much looser because sometimes the top line that we hear is one instrument, sometimes it's more, and then sometimes those 2 instruments diverge and they become more than one thing. And this is done with such tactfulness that it doesn't seem strange, because it would be strange if it was handled sloppily. This sort of orchestrational creativity is what makes me think that if Bach was around 200 years later than he was, he would have jumped at the chance to make some interesting orchestrational choices with the modern instruments of that era, and he would have had a lot of variety quickly, not just staying in one affect like he would. I think he would have embraced the idea of the orchestration being able to change the mood quickly, even though it's just not like the era he lived in. But you can see like hints of it here. It's not really changing the mood here, but you know that he would have been capable of that. And this does actually, the simplicity of this trumpet line, even though it's probably just because of the instrument, the simplicity of it does remind you of the classical period, which came later. It's obviously objectively impossible to say what he would have done if he had lived in the future. But I think with his level of creativity, he was already looking forward in that way. I think you're right. One curious thing about this introduction that is a subjective experience is that I believe it's a little bit ambiguous about the meter or how many beats are in each measure until it gets going. It is definitively 4 beats per measure. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and 1 E and a 2 and so on. But because of the way the harmony works, I do like the effect that is a little misleading for just 1.5 measures, because it sounds like it could be 2 measures of 3. It could be 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and a 2E and a 3 and a 1. And then it breaks down because it doesn't work anymore. But since we know that Bach is not going to change time signatures right there, then we can be assured that it is instead one of these situations where he leaves the rhythmic placement, the beat sure-footedness, a little bit ambiguous on purpose for a few seconds until we get into it. He does this a lot at the opening of movements of his music. Things starting on beat 2, for example, out of 4. That's a good way to throw off a listener. And in this case, we don't start on beat 2, we start on beat 1, but we have this do-sol situation that is seeming like it could be setting up something on beat 1, even though it's actually beat 4 and not beat 1. And then, more strongly, I think, you have a strong and firm cadence in the tonic key of C major on beat 3 instead of beat 1. But it would be beat 1 if it was in 3/4. It would be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 is that moment. But instead, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And beat 3 is not exactly where I expected. I expected with my ears that if there were to be 4 prominent beats in a measure, then beat 1 would be where important things like those cadences land on. But this is unusual because a lot of times it's the other way around, where I'm hearing it a certain way, But then I have to realize, no, Bach is going to put the cadence where it lands on the tonic chord. He's going to put that on beat 1 a lot. But here, he's not. He's putting that on beat 3 of the second bar. I just can't hear it another way until the second number 3 or second 4. So it's so weird because I've never heard it that way. Yeah. It's just like it's got in my head that way. It's kind of like how it's hard to hear where the beat is when a song starts sometimes, even if you know the song. Kind of like Lowrider. You know, Lowrider's like that, the cowbell thing. It's kind of hard to tell. I don't know that for that song. I don't think I've had that problem with that song. I know what you mean. I've had that problem with other songs. I don't know how you could know where the beat is in Lowrider until a few seconds in. Yeah, it just starts on beat 1. Okay, so upon listening to Lowrider again, it's obvious that the first cowbell note is actually on beat 1. Well, now it's like flipped. It's like one of those magic illusions. It's flipped in my brain now. I can't hear it the other way. I can only hear it the correct way now. Yeah. There's a Bach piece that always does this for me. Not this one, but it's Orchestral Suite number 2, the final movement, the Badinerie movement. It's kind of a famous little melody by Bach, one of his more known. It's a flute melody. It's so, to me, it just feels so much like 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2. Like those are the downbeats, but in the score, it's a pickup. 1 2 1. And it makes sense when you think about it harmonically. That's where it's landing. That's a good one. Another one that comes to mind is the last movement of Gottes Zeit. It sounds like 1 and a 2, 3 and a 4, 1, but it's not. It's 2 and a 3, 4 and a 1. Yep. Well, even Machadish, which is the music that we use in our opening and ending, for me, the beginning of that sounds like normal, like I can tell where the beat is, but about, 10 or 15 seconds in, this thing is like not quite, if I'm not listening closely, I start thinking it's off by one beat, full like dotted quarter beat of the 12/8. Yeah. And now, here is the beginning of that 9th movement of BWV 147, Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben, the bass aria, Ich will von Jesu Wundern singen. If this introduction to a musical moment by Bach has inspired you to listen to the rest of this cantata, please check out the link in our episode description. It's such a delightful one to listen to if you are new to listening to Bach cantatas because it's grounded by those 5th and 10th movements, which are the ones that you know. You'll recognize that. You'll recognize them. Jesu Joy of Man's Desire. Exactly, and yet it still also includes a lot of things that are just delightful to listen to on the first listen that aren't as hard of listening as some Bach things can be, and those are especially the movements that we've discussed, Movement 1, and then the focus of this episode, Movement 9. What's next? Next week we'll do a little comparing BWV 1052, a harpsichord concerto, and its violin reconstruction, BWV 1052R. The Netherlands Bach Society has 2 recordings of the violin version of this, and we'll also compare it with its source, which is from a cantata, which actually features an organ instead of a violin and harpsichord. There's a lot of comparing we'll be doing between these instrumental versions next week on the show. Until next time, enjoy those moments.